Hello again. This is the fourth interview for the Open University Gender Critical Research Network, and it's my distinct pleasure to be able to interview Professor Rosa Freedman. Now, you and I share a few things in common, Rosa. We seem to have been joined at the hip over the summer because of those things. That's namely Essex and their wonderful behavior towards us. But today I don't really want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about academic freedom. I actually want to ask you about your job as an academic, what it is that you do in terms of research. So can you just fill us in and talk to us a little bit about, I don't know, what is that thing you're a specialist in? Human rights.
So thank you, Joe. Thank you for letting me be part of this interview series. And it's a great privilege to be interviewed by you. So what do? My official title is Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development. I'm a professor in the law school at the University of Reading, and I was appointed there in 2016 to be in the law school, but also to set up a research division that spans across 4 different areas on global development. So it spans across law, it spans across international development, particularly looking at meteorology and agriculture, because that's the specialisms in Reading and where the development department is housed. It also has human geographers and some economists who are development economists. So the reason I was appointed for that position is that my career has always spanned law and international relations and law and development. I wrote my PhD thesis between 2008 and 2011 on the UN Human Rights Council, which is the main human rights body for the UN. It's like you have the General Assembly, like you have the Security Council, the Human Rights Council. It's not got quite the same status, but it's the main one. And it was created in 2006, coming on the back of the previous body, the commission that had preceded it, pretty much failing because of politicization. And so in 2008, when I started my PhD, I wanted to look at this very new body. The reason I wanted to look at this very new body was I thought that would mean I didn't have to do much reading. Not true, not true. But what it did allow me to do was to really unpack the gap. Anne-Marie Slaughter talks about bridging this gap between international relations and international law. Lawyers see things as ideal, and international relations see things as how the practicalities, how to get there. Yeah. So I wrote my PhD thesis on that, and I published on the Human Rights Council during that time. And then I got a job as a teaching fellow in Birmingham, at the University of Birmingham. And this is important because I took my first job and I became a lecturer, and then I was appointed senior lecturer before moving to Reading. But it was at Birmingham that I really became known for sewing together law and development. I continued to work on human rights research, and I started working with a colleague, my collaborative partner, or my work brother, as I call him, called Nicholas. And he was in the International Development Department. And he came to me one day, we'd met and we were talking about theories of hybridity and things like that. And one day he said to me, Rosa, I work with an organization that seeks to implement law and justice and democracy in Haiti. And they've asked me if I know anyone who could help them sue the United Nations. I said, okay, Nick. I said, I don't think it's possible, but we can give it a try through a human rights-based approach. And I remember sitting on the floor with lots of my master's notes, my handwritten notes, and lots of books around me for about 5 days. And I drafted up a sort of policy report for them on whether you could sue the United Nations, and if so, on what grounds. What they wanted to sue the United Nations for was because the UN in 2010, after the earthquake in Haiti, the UN stabilization operation out there, brought cholera into Haiti for the first time in recorded knowledge. One of the few terrible things that Haiti hasn't had to face was cholera. And not only did the UN bring cholera into Haiti, and anyone that's interested in this, I've written lots, including lots of media articles, things like that. You could go away, and lots of other people have as well. Not only did they bring cholera into Haiti, they refused to accept responsibility or acknowledge that they brought cholera in, and they refused to take the steps to contain and eradicate it. Okay. So by 2013, when this organization approached Nick, who's a Haiti specialist and had been, he's lived in many countries like Haiti or Timor-Leste and things, Nick came to me. At this point, the UN was basically saying, we're not even going to answer questions on this. And that started my real diving into development studies, and particularly international development. And I of course take issue with the name itself, which is colonialist, and starting with Haiti, starting with my knowledge of the UN and human rights and UN accountability and international law and avenues for justice and what does justice mean. And we worked for years on how to help resolve the Haiti cholera crisis, Haiti cholera claims, which I don't know because they haven't told me either way, but I know that Birmingham were planning on putting this in as a big ref impact case study for international development as well as for us. And the reason I say that is it got very well funded, but we went to the very highest levels. And it wasn't, of course, we were one cog in a wheel, but we went to the very highest levels of the UN. We spent a lot of time working in Haiti. And I mean, the outcome is that there was an apology from Ban Ki-moon before he left post.
Wow.
There was a plan for how to eradicate and clear up cholera, but of course it always comes back to funding, and it's woefully underfunded. And there was a plan for some form of remedies for victims of cholera. Because of that work, I then became very involved with another huge UN accountability and peacekeeping issue, which is how to prevent and remedy sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers or civilians. And since 2015, I've been working on that. And since moving to Reading, I've been working with an organization called Keeping Children Safe, where we don't just look at UN peacekeeping operations. We look at conflict and crisis zones. We work with what was the Department for International Development here, now the FCDO, about all of their largest implementing partners, the largest NGOs, how to implement proper safeguarding. We worked with Ambassador Ian Duddy, who was the UK ambassador in Uruguay, as a pilot study to implement safeguarding across the entire Uruguayan military, because the Uruguayans give a lot of, they have a lot of peacekeepers come from Uruguay, because in order to justify having a military in a previous military democracy, your military have to be doing something good, right? Which is why they're Latin American peacekeepers. They've implemented safeguarding across the military, and it has gone so well that UNICEF have now funded regional peacekeeping training centers to implement safeguarding across all militaries that contribute troops to the UN.
Can I ask a question here quickly? So keeping children safe, is that from all forms of abuse or from sexual abuse specifically? And is it framed within a child's rights or within social services broadly?
No, so Keeping Children Safe is a global organization. It's a global network, and it was set up after what was exposed in West Africa of humanitarians and peacekeepers, widespread abuse of all forms, but particularly sexual abuse of children. Keeping Children Safe looks at safeguarding of all abuse in relation to children, and from a child's rights angle, and from an international human rights best practice standards. Within this work, we aren't only looking at children. Within this work, we look at safeguarding of all sexual exploitation and abuse, but not only of children. So really it comes down to, people often think, oh, we need to have some great big new shiny court to solve things. No, we don't. What we need to do is have robust, evidence-based, actionable feedback going into organizations and working with them to understand organizational culture, to understand what a code of conduct is, how to protect whistleblowers, to understand how to make reporting accessible, say, to children or to people who aren't literate, all sorts of things. And again, we've got a project website on this, which, if people are interested, really shows what we've done and how we've done it, and the field research involved and the desk research, and where there's, again, this idea between law and practice. So they're my sort of broad areas. I've also worked on a project with a colleague who's at Durham on something called the UN Gender Network, where we were looking at the UN and how to address what the best practice was within the UN, and both in terms of having more women at senior positions and not just parachuting them in, but growing them, but also looking at lots and lots of related issues. That was an AHRC funded network. So that was bringing in my kind of women's rights side to my UN work. And then lots of the other work I do over the years focuses on other UN mechanisms like the UN Special Procedures mandate holders. So yes, I wrote an edited collection on that with lots of great contributors from the UN, from practice and so on. But I also work with mandate holders themselves. So the mandate holder on freedom of religion or belief, I helped him to write the first ever UN report on anti-Semitism as a human rights abuse, or the UN Special Rapporteur, independent expert on Iran and on human rights. So, and a lot of the work, whether it's the writing work in terms of academic publications, or my media work, or my kind of more policy focused work, is really looking at rights of minorities. I'm not a specialist on the right to life or the right to food. I know lots about them, right? But the work that I've been most interested in and to date, and supporting the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of migrants, from the old one, Francois Crapeau, and particularly looking at migrants' rights around Europe, irregular migrants coming to Europe. So lots of the work that I focus on is about minority rights and group rights, and and how that works within the system. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it wasn't, and I got lots of little questions to ask. Can we go back to the child abuse and keeping children safe? Can you talk a little bit about how you balance? Well, let me back up. The question that I'm coming from, or the place that I'm coming from and asking this question rather, is that fairly well-known critique of human rights. Yeah. What happens when we recognize life as is lived on the ground, and how those universal human rights might not map necessarily onto what happens in real life living situations. So with that kind of critique in mind, just thinking about the keeping children safe, how did you, either in your research or in your recommendations or in the ongoing work that you do, begin to think through the balancing of rights there? So, keeping children safe presupposes there's an age of sexual consent, doesn't it? Really, presupposes that there are particular sorts of family arrangements in place. It presupposes a lot about the lives of children that may not necessarily be happening on the ground. Did you find things like that?
So we start from the approach that with any organization that we work with, from a library all the way through to the UN, right, that there are international standards. So the international standard, the human rights standard on the age of a child, is up to 18, right? But that's qualified within the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because it says unless a person attains majority within the local context. So, for example, how can we have 17-year-olds in this country going off and fighting in wars and shooting guns, right? Okay, how can we have 16-year-olds being able to get married with their parents' permission? So human rights are an ideal, they're a standard. But the reason that, and I'm going to segue and then come back to your question,
that's fine.
Why would any country sign up to one of these human rights treaties? Okay, it's a unilateral pledge, right? They're not getting anything back for it, right? It's not like I'm going to buy your cucumbers, you're going to buy my tomatoes, and we've got a bilateral agreement. And especially if these human rights conventions say things like a child's a child to 18, and they think, well, we're the UK, we want to send a 17-year-old out to war. So countries are allowed to put in something called a reservation to a treaty. So long as the reservation doesn't undermine the purpose of the treaty, they're allowed to put a reservation in. So I think for a long time, I might get this wrong, but I think for a long time, the UK had a reservation about the monarchy. That, in terms of the Convention on Eliminating Discrimination Against Women, they said, yes, okay, we're going to eliminate discrimination against but here are reservations, and one of them is that if a girl is born before a boy in a royal family, the boy still becomes the king before she becomes queen. So those types of things. And but we say these are international standards. So a child is a child till they're 18. But then what do we do, as you say, when we're working with an organization and we're thinking about local context? This is where the research is crucial. And this is where, when I say evidence-based approaches to safeguarding, a lot of people look at safeguarding as a buzzword. We look at it, or keeping children safe, look at it, and I also, because I work with them, and because this is why the relationship between academia and practice often is so fruitful. I will do, before we go to a country, I will do a legal mapping. And a legal mapping can be 40, 50 pages of the laws, but also the practices and the context of a country. So we might be looking at a country where the laws are that you're criminalized for being gay, right? Yeah. Or for homosexual acts, right? So then what happens if a man rapes a boy? Yeah. In law, that can't happen. It doesn't exist, right? Even though it's existed in fact. And then what's the context within that? By reporting that in, would we be making that child less safe, right? Yeah. There are some police forces that we've come across, and I mean, they work in pretty much every country in the world. There are some police forces where if you report in that a child who's living on the streets has been abused, the police are likely to themselves perpetrate abuse against that child. Yeah. There are countries where if you report in that a child has been abused, that child becomes ostracized from their family, either because of, they are seen as contaminated, tainted, or in some settings, and this is particularly true in some places where the UN operates, the peacekeepers are there preventing a civil war. And if a family reports in that their child has been abused by the peacekeepers, the rest of the people in their community, there will be people in their community who say, but now they've just taken this entire battalion, platoon, contingent, I never know, groups of soldiers away. Because you've been reporting in exploitation or abuse, and now who's going to protect us from a genocide? So it's always got to be contextual, but these standards have always got to be international standards, and then working through what safeguarding looks like within the context in which you're operating.
So I take from that actually your real skills and expertise in this field is both being able to understand the context, but then also to figure out how, when, where, why, and under what conditions you may have to balance one off against another.
Yeah, and that's really where Keeping Children Safe's expertise, and particularly the CEO Sarah Blakemore, where their expertise comes in. I can sit, like the good law academic that I am, and research all of the laws and the context, and read the cases, and read through the UN human rights reports and the NGO reports about what's going on the ground. But they then take that and they go into an organization and they say, right, now let's talk through how this translates, this alongside the Keeping Children Safe sort of best practice and models for safeguarding. How do we now make this work so that safeguarding happens, and so that at the end of the day, the best interests of the child are always being met in any setting? So my expertise is the research, the law, the human rights. Doing what I enjoy the most, which people might not believe given the amount of media, but doing what I do best and enjoy the most, sitting quietly in a room and researching.
So here's another question then. You said that broadly speaking, you are an academic who specializes not in rights full stop, but rights of minorities. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So something that really has always motivated me in the kind of rights work that I do has been minority rights. And I don't know whether that is nature or nurture. It could well be both. But I think there's certainly the nurture side, growing up in a community where many of my friends' grandparents and many of my grandparents' friends had survived the Holocaust, and where this was discussed with us because grandparents talk to grandchildren in a different way to the way they talk to their own children. Where we grew up not in the shadow of that, but we grew up as this being very much part of our identity. And reading books about from the perspective of children, and all sorts of things that I was born in the 80s that was starting to happen then. Right. So I don't know whether there's a nature side or whether there's also this nurture side. My parents say that, as a child, the thing I said most often was, it's not fair. Like a sense of fairness, right? It's not fair. Like, why are you doing that? That's unjust, right? It could just be, why did my brother get an extra sweet more than me? That's not fair. It could be anything, but fairness. But the minority rights issue for me, I've been so privileged to be mentored by and work with some of the most incredible UN human rights practitioners and scholars. And I think because here I was, this baby PhD student turning up physically in Geneva, watching Human Rights Council sessions and all sorts, and asking people. I've always asked to interview people because you get so much more knowledge from insiders than you can ever from books.
Quite.
Obviously, I'd only ever studied law, so my interview skills were just learn on the job. But then later on, I went and read theory to back them up and to hone them. And lots of these people have themselves were working on minority rights. So whether they're working on women's rights, rights of political dissidents in China, rights of religious minorities. And so that also inspired me. And I mean, literally inspired me to want to go down that route. I think there's very interesting legal discussions around the right to life or the right to food and around the case law. But I'm not that interested. I've written now 5 books. I don't think I've cited more than a handful of cases, right? And most of those will be cases in terms of, can we sue the UN? Not in terms of human rights cases. And so I've always worked with and gone down that route. I mean, and when I say privileged, I've been privileged to be invited as the sort of UN Human Rights Council expert, special procedures expert, who goes to some of the most incredible conferences. And I don't mean these big academic conferences where you present your work for 5 minutes and then go off with your mates for coffee. I mean the kind of closed workshop 3-day one. And most recently, well, not most recently, but fairly recently, but because of COVID, nothing's happened. I was invited to go to Tunisia. It was January. So we went up to Carthage or near Carthage, and they could take one of these hotels that's normally really busy and expensive, but they could take it for security reasons, take a lot of it, because I don't explain why. And we could stay there and have these incredible sessions, and then all the conversations in the margins. And there were women there they brought in basically women to discuss women's rights across the Middle East and North Africa region. So I'm going to try and not talk in acronyms.
It's all right.
women human rights defenders who, they really needed to make sure there was security for these women, so particularly those who were living abroad from their home countries and were political activists. And sitting in those rooms, sitting in rooms with listening to people from the Baha'i faith discussing the human rights issues, and then being able to play a tiny role in talking about the different human rights mechanisms that they might want to be able to access, or that might help in a small way. I mean, it's such a privilege. And often with minorities, it's not so much that they're forgotten about, they're hidden, because if they speak out, by stepping out of the shadows of the door frame, right? And I think this always with irregular migrants, they're exposing themselves.
Absolutely.
And so if people like me, who have all this privilege and platform and a little bit of knowledge that might be helpful, if people like me don't speak out for minorities, who is going to?
Yeah, well, and also, there's no point having rights if there aren't mechanisms to be able to either enforce them or secure them. And so you come with the knowledge of being able to secure or enforce it, or at least know what the context is outside their immediate context that they may be able to access, which provides that really crucial, both, I hate the words knowledge exchange, but that is in effect what's going on, is that you can lend your expertise to a particular given area. So we've got about 7 more minutes, right? I'm being a strict timekeeper today. I've asked all 3 of the other interviewees, I've asked them what gender critical means to them. This is part of the Open University Gender Critical Research Network. You don't need to answer that because you already did in the launch podcast, in point of fact. But is there anything that you would like to say that kind of touches on that notion of gender critical and human rights? I mean, you've had situations where you've not been able to talk about things. Is there anything that you'd like to say just generally to the membership? We've got about 2,500 people on the Twitter account. So, and at last look, 5,000 people had watched our launch podcast, and around 500 each Alice and Laura's interview. So there's some kind of platform here.
I mean, I don't consider myself gender critical. It's a term that has been foisted on me. I consider myself.
I hear you.
Yeah, I'm a human rights person, and I am my feminist perspective is radical feminism. This term gender critical is something that that has been created by others, and I wouldn't term myself as that, but I understand that other people might label me as that. It comes down to, for me, as with everything, how to resolve conflicts of rights. And usually we resolve a conflict of rights by saying, here's the big, powerful state, here's the weak individual, and so we need to find mechanisms and remedies for the weak individual. Where there's conflicts of rights between groups, there's usually, here's the powerful group, and here's the weaker group, and we tend to look at rights in that way. In that same way of how do we deal with the power inequalities in this situation. Where it's come to these discussions, tomorrow will be the 3-year anniversary since I first tweeted about this publicly, and then got on a plane to New York and had no idea that by the time I got off the plane, I'd have an email from my Dean for Diversity and Inclusion asking me why I was being transphobic. But what I've said and what I will continue to say on this topic is, here you've got two minority groups. There may be, people may say, well, there's a power inequality because there are numerically more females in the world than there are trans individuals. But when we're thinking about powers, we're not actually talking about power vis-a-vis each other. We're talking about power within patriarchal structures, within state structures, and so on. And women's rights almost always, you know, towards the back of the queue, if not right at the back, vis-a-vis any other minority. So, and we see that throughout history. We see, you know, in Ireland, the suffragettes being told, could you just wait a minute until we've got rid of the English, you know, always in civil rights movements, women are asked to wait at the back of the queue and help the civil rights movement. So to me, it's very clear we have to resolve a conflict of rights here. It's not actually for anyone to resolve that conflict of rights other than the government, because it's the government that has human rights obligations. The government has ratified these conventions. The government has certain obligations vis-a-vis its population. What the government has done, as successive governments have done, is leave a vacuum. Successive policymakers and judges have shied away from this issue. The fact that the most recent definition of sex in law dates from Corbett and Corbett, which was before I was born, the case in 1970 about April Ashley, who was a transsexual model and who married some guy from high society. I always remember, you know, this, when I first talked about this with my grandma, she said, oh, that was across the newspapers for years, you know, because it was some high society case, and, you know, in the days before Twitter. So, you know, they've shied away from this for years. It's not for me to define, right, to make a new definition. And certainly we need a definition of gender identity. We need a definition of gender reassignment. I mean, the Equality Act doesn't define it. But all I've been saying, and all I continue to say, is we all have human rights by virtue of being born human. Sometimes there are conflicts of rights between different groups. So a group might say, I want to attend a faith school, but I'm not from that faith, but I'm from whatever background, and we have to rule whether or not they can. So, so I'm not really answering your question, but I am answering the side of, is there anything more I want to say? It fascinates me that within all of these discussions from a human rights lens, that there are certain rights of mine that become violated that aren't related to the topic, right? Which is the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act and things like that. But also the fact that people start thinking of me and of others involved in this as not humans. We've got people who are anti-fascist, really left-wing, really are out there fighting for rights of minorities, but also at the same time are perpetrators against us because we have become almost dehumanized. And that's not to say that there aren't trans individuals who are also being dehumanized. And that's not to say that, you know, that one individual or one group is having a worse or better time within this hideous toxicity. But it's just, it is fascinating to me, that side.
I mean, that's really where sociology comes in, isn't it? You know, as you're talking, I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, because rights often ends up just being, I'm just keeping half an eye on time. We have like 1 or 2 minutes, but rights gets you, I mean, often when we're talking about our rights, what we're actually talking about is our desires. And it's not necessarily mapped onto the sort of structures that you were talking about with regards to the state or government or law or courts. So I think, I mean, it's an interesting moment in history, isn't it, really, just in terms of how much purchase a kind of popularized version of the notion of rights has become, and how we use the language of rights to talk about social conflicts, which, you know, is just, you know, my little sociology 101 in this area. But like I said, I'm aware of time. I don't have a final question for you, but is there anything finally that you'd like to say just to kind of sign off the interview part?
I think I just want to say thank you to you and to John Pike and to the OU for setting up this research network. Setting up research networks at the best of time is time consuming and a lot of admin. And I have one research grant, by the way, I'm going off on a tangent, that spans the UN, my university, and a state government who's funding it. And the managing bureaucracies of all three meant it took a year for the grant documents to be signed off, because anyone that doesn't work in the university has no idea, but three bureaucracies. But no, I'm really pleased that you've set this up. I'm pleased to see pretty much any research network being set up, because that's our job. And I get such privilege and pleasure from teaching. Less pleasure from being the ref UOA lead, but there are so many parts of my job that are great, you know, being able to work with policymakers, everything else. But at the heart of everything I do is research, and the more conversations that we have, no matter how difficult they are, the more research can be done to hopefully address key societal issues, whatever those issues are. So just thank you to you and to John and to the OU.
No, please. I think, you know, it's this summer we haven't really been able to do much beyond have these sort of podcast interviews. You know, it's partly COVID, it's partly that, you know, it's actually the beginning of getting to know each other, and also providing some content for people outside of the university context who may need a kind of oh, what do they call it? You know, just like a shallow end of a pool to be able to get into some of the kind of more terms of art that we use within the academy. But thank you, Rosa. Yeah, sorry, Karen.
Just to say to any of those people, anyone that's listening to this, not that I imagine many people will, because I'm not that interesting. If there's any aspects of my research that do interest you and you don't want to read the dry academic papers, my email address is clearly very publicly available, because I get all sorts of lovely emails. Drop me a line, tell me if there's bits that you're interested in. I've done so many media interviews, written so much for the media across the world on all of these topics. I'm really happy to share them. And of course, if I don't hear anything from anyone, I'll just look out for the emails that tell me to F off and die.
Well, let's hope you don't get too many of those. And I personally want to thank you for all sorts of things, not least of which is being a fantastic bunker mate in the war zone that has been our summer. But I would like to just put a marker in the sand. I think that the OU Gender Critical Network can actually pull together quite a bit of expertise around childhood, safety, risk, sexual exploitation. There are quite a few of us that have an interest broadly in that. So this is really a kind of statement for people listening. Watch this space. It may be that we begin to develop a theme around some of those issues. With that, thank you very much, Rosa. And I'll just stop the recording now.